The man accused of keeping a CIA counter-terrorism program hidden from Congress for 8 years. What murky secrets is Dick Cheney hiding? And has he broken the law to do it? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Shuli Ghosh. Welcome to the programme. The Bush legacy continues, and this time the spotlight is on former Vice President Dick Cheney. It's claimed he ordered the Central Intelligence Agency to withhold information about a secret counter-terrorism programme from Congress for 8 years. Details of the operation remain shrouded in mystery. What is known is that it started shortly after the September 11th attacks, and it's being widely speculated that it involved the formation of assassination teams which could be dispatched overseas to kill senior al-Qaeda leaders. Officials say the plans were vague and were never carried out. The program was terminated last month when the new director of the CIA, Leon Panetta, learned about it. He told 2 congressional intelligence committees that the plan had been hidden from lawmakers initially at the instruction of Cheney. While the Democrats called for an investigation, rival Republicans backed Cheney's move.
The executive branch of government cannot create programs like these programs and keep Congress in the dark. There is a requirement for disclosure. It has to be done in an appropriate way so it doesn't jeopardize our national security. But to have a massive program that is concealed from the leaders in Congress is not only inappropriate, it could be illegal.
I believe that Vice President Cheney served his country with as much fidelity as he could possibly give to it, and he tried to serve us in an effective way. And I hope that nothing like this would impact on his outstanding record.
Let me introduce our guests to you today. In Lisbon, we have Richard Falk, Professor of International Law at Princeton University. And in Detroit, Marcy Wheeler, a political blogger and commentator. So let's just talk about the questions of legality first. Richard, you're the law expert. Under the National Security Act, Congress is required to be briefed about CIA operations, isn't it?
Yes, that's a really serious requirement. It came out of the experience with the Vietnam War and the Cold War, where unauthorized assassinations were taking place under executive authority, and that created a sense of a very dangerous and bad precedent. And so this new set of disclosures alerts us to the fact that we've had an unconstitutional process of government during the Bush-Cheney years.
But doesn't the government have leeway in disclosing information that might be deemed exceptionally sensitive?
It has considerable discretion, but when the vice president actively tries to prevent Congress from knowing of a major program that is certain to be controversial, it goes against not only the legal requirements of the National Security Act, but against the fundamental constitutional principle of checks and balances, which tries to prevent autocratic government by giving Congress some means to oversee what a president and an executive branch do, even in times of national emergency.
Marcy, I know that you've blogged at length on other practices carried out in the name of national security, like waterboarding. Is there any justification for keeping an operation covert?
No, I mean, this revelation, one of the reasons it's so offensive is that it comes on top of what has become clear, which is that the CIA did not reveal aspects of its torture program until after the fact, until years into the program. Both Porter Goss and Nancy Pelosi make it clear when they were first briefed in September 2002 that the CIA was engaged, was going, the CIA basically came to them and said, well, we're thinking about using these torture tactics. They didn't call it that. But that was after the CIA had already waterboarded Abu Zubaydah 83 times. They didn't tell them they had already done it. They just kind of moved forward. And there were several other examples where, just on torture itself, where the CIA claimed that they had briefed people in Congress and in fact had not briefed them or had briefed them differently than they recorded. And then we just got an IG report on the domestic surveillance program on Friday, and the same thing. We're finding that John Yoo did not even reveal to the Attorney General everything about that domestic surveillance program, much less to Congress. And so these are two major programs already where
but what about
Congress was kind of left in the dark, or other people.
I mean, this particular project that people are talking about. I mean, first of all, how much credibility does this have that there were plans to set up international hit squads to take out Al-Qaeda leaders?
You know, there was an interesting article in The Guardian yesterday which actually said it was formed in CIA and then moved to Special Operations, and that there actually was an assassination in Kenya in 2007, and there was some political pushback. And one of the things that the Bush administration did, particularly with things like assassination squads, was move it into defense, move it, the special ops under defense, and say, well, this is really about preparing the battlefield, so we don't have to tell Congress about that. And at least the Guardian article suggests that that's one of the things that happened with this program as well. And again, there's no legal basis to say because something's an intelligence program in the Defense Department, it doesn't need to be briefed to the intelligence committees as well.
Well, let me bring Richard in on this because, I mean, clearly there's a lot of speculation about exactly what this program was, but it's said to have been created in the furore after 9/11.
Yes, I think that there was this kind of good faith sense of urgency on the part of the Cheney leadership in the White House and the executive branch, but that makes no justification from a legal point of view or from a political constitutional point of view for overlooking the failures to respect the Constitution, to respect international law, and to respect the national security framework of law. They're two different things, because a good faith autocrat is still an autocrat, and the idea that Cheney was acting out of his sense of what was in the national interest is not really a relevant consideration. What's relevant is, are these practices permissible, and do they conform with our form of government? And I think what Marcy said about the wider context in the domain of torture and interrogation and detention practices, there's no doubt that this was not an anomaly. This was something that this leadership intended as a whole way of taking into the executive branch powers of government that should have been divided and shared with Congress.
Okay, well, the former vice president has so far remained silent about the accusations facing him. But in March, Cheney strongly defended the Bush administration's anti-terrorism policies, saying, "I think those programs were absolutely essential to the success we enjoyed of being able to collect the intelligence that let us defeat all further attempts to launch attacks on the US since 9/11. Marcy, what do you think of that justification, that there are some things which have to be done and which are justified in the name of national security?
Well, the record doesn't hold up to what Cheney is saying. I mean, one thing we know is that the Inspector General for the CIA said there's no reason to believe torture was effective. I mean, aside from the fact that it's illegal, there's no reason to believe that the information we got from Abu Zubaydah Khalid Sheikh Mohammed we couldn't have gotten through other means. And in fact, we know that Abu Zubaydah was cooperating before they started torturing him. Even Dick Cheney himself admits that the third person they waterboarded, Rahim al-Nashiri, that it didn't work. His daughter has said that as well. For some reason, they did it twice to him, stopped, and they admit that it didn't work. And then, you know, on Friday, when the other Inspector General report came out about the domestic surveillance program, they came to the same conclusion, that there was no reason to think this was an effective program, that it wasn't generating counterterrorism leads, that it was inundating people with information, that it was too compartmented so people couldn't use the information. And to go back to what Richard said, I mean, had they gone to Congress and said, here's our interrogation program, and been truthful about the fact that the FBI had skilled interrogators who spoke Arabic, who knew Al-Qaeda, and instead that they had chosen to go with contractors who had never done interrogations, who didn't speak Arabic, who didn't have a background in Al-Qaeda, then you would think that Congress would have said, well, let's go with FBI then, because they've got the experience to do this effectively, and we would have all been better off.
But in this case, I mean, the anger seems to be from Democrat lawmakers that they were kept in the dark rather than what the actual plan was.
Right, yeah. I mean, that's the point, is that on all of these programs, we don't know about this latest assassination squad program, but on all the other programs, you can point to moments where, had they actually had the experts review it, for example, on the domestic surveillance program, they didn't have the guys who actually try counterterrorism cases review what they were doing until 2 or 3 years into the process. Had they had the experts review the process, whether it's in Congress or even within the executive branch, then they would have been a lot more effective. But Cheney took secrecy to such a level that none of the experts were reviewing it, and he ended up being much less effective in the counterterrorism fight than he should have been.
Richard, isn't there any case in saying that actually nothing, I mean, this plan seemed to be at the talking stage only. Whether anything happened under it, the evidence seems to be no. So therefore, did he actually have to go and clear it with the intelligence committees?
I don't think we know enough about what it was that was done to make a really intelligent assessment about that. But I think it's important to appreciate that the fundamental issue isn't even whether it was effective or not. The question is whether Cheney was violating the law and whether his judgment as to what was required for national security should take precedence over the law, over the obligation to disclose programs of this sort to Congress.
And do you think he was violating the law? Was he acting illegally?
Well, certainly in the broad pattern of what we now know about what he did and tried to have happen, it's clear that he violated both fundamental constitutional principles and more concrete legislative restrictions, as well as violating international humanitarian law and the Torture Convention. There are a whole series of things that he did and was associated with that amount to crimes of state, and he should be held accountable if the country is to take the rule of law seriously for the powerful as well as for the weak.
OK, I want to remind our viewers of some of the background, some of the points that both of you have brought up. Under the Bush administration, several controversial policies were introduced in the name of national security. These include harsh interrogation techniques approved by the Justice Department, such as waterboarding, and indefinite detention in facilities like Guantanamo Bay, where suspects had no access to the legal system. President Barack Obama announced an end to these practices shortly after taking office. However, he has authorised the CIA to continue the practice of rendition, that is, transferring terrorist suspects to other countries for interrogation. And his administration is continuing the Bush-era policy of spying on Americans without a warrant, eavesdropping on phone calls and emails. These policies are currently under review. Let me remind you of my guests today. In Lisbon, we have Professor Richard Falk, and in Detroit, we have Marcy Wheeler. Marcy, what purpose would an investigation serve other than to further damage America's reputation and weaken the CIA?
I don't think it damages America's reputation. I think it is a signal to the rest of the world that America actually, believes what it says. President Obama was in Ghana just last week, and said some important things about democracy, that you have to be able to hold the powerful to the rule of law. And frankly, I'm fairly certain that those words were added into the speech at the last minute. They weren't in what was sent out by the White House from the start. And for President Obama to go overseas and say to Africa, to the Middle East, to Europe, that we believe in the rule of law and you have to hold the powerful accountable, means that he also has to do that at home. He has to be willing to hold his predecessors to account for what they did that violated the law.
But so you don't accept that there are any circumstances where a state has to operate in secrecy? You're saying that everything has to be out in the open. I mean, nations can't operate like that, can they?
Well, I mean, we have the ability in our court system to keep secret evidence, to introduce evidence in such a way that it doesn't go into the public record if it's going to hurt national security. So you don't have to say, we're going to expose all of our dirty laundry if we're going to hold Dick Cheney accountable. What you have to say is that you have to let the legal process work the way it is supposed to work. And you know, to go back to Richard's point, Dick Cheney didn't have to go tell the world that he planned on torturing Al-Qaeda suspects.
Richard, I know you wanted to make a point on that. What do you say to that?
Yes, of course. See, it's a false issue to say that the country, the U.S. government, cannot have a certain degree of secrecy for national security purposes. What it is saying is that that degree of secrecy needs to be regulated in a constitutional fashion so that it's not abused within the governmental process itself. And here we see what happens when secrecy is manipulated within the government, not in relation to public opinion or to foreign awareness. We see that it encourages patterns of governance that are oppressive to the citizenry itself and violative of the rule of law. So it's a very important understanding to suggest that if the rule of law is to be meaningful, as Marcy suggested, in democratic societies, we, the United States, has to show that we take it seriously for ourselves, or else our preaching to others is empty moralism at its worst.
Okay, well, let's take a Republican view on this. This is what Senator John McCain had to say on whether there should be investigations into past anti-terror policies.
We don't want to give the terrorists and the radical Islamic extremists more tools and bullets to shoot against us. And help.
Richard, more ammunition for the enemy?
I think we have to show that we care about our own principles of law and of constitutional governance. And by showing that clearly and with integrity, it is an answer to terrorism. It's an answer to the kind of extremism that is a threat to American society. And so I think I feel exactly the opposite from Senator McCain. As long as we keep secret these shadowy policies that get into the media in any event, it is shameful for the country, and it makes the critiques by extremist groups around the world have a certain plausibility. So I think for our own sake, for the sake of national interest, for the sake of our future as a country, it's incumbent upon ourselves not only to disclose to Congress what has been happening, but to hold individuals like Dick Cheney accountable for his violations of domestic law and of international law.
Well, Richard, it is interesting that President Obama has held on to some Bush policies, the surveillance and the renditions. I mean, has he realized that you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs?
Well, I can't see into President Obama's mind, but I regret and feel disappointed by the extent that he seems to have accepted some of the Bush policies that do go against law and morality.
Marcy, I wanted to ask you, because we were talking about waterboarding before. It's possible that there may still be an investigation into waterboarding, but President Obama has said that anyone operating according to the legal advice that was accepted at the time wouldn't be prosecuted. What do you think about that?
Yeah, but it's crystal clear that the torture started before the memos, the legal memos were written. So there's 2 months maybe of actions that are prosecutable there. It's clear the recent OLC memos that came out and the CIA IG report that may come out in a couple of weeks both make it clear that one of the guys who was doing the waterboarding, and there's a direct quote in there where he says something like, "Oh yeah, I know I exceeded the amount of water and covered up the ability to breathe, and I did that to make it more realistic and poignant." But that's basically an admission from one of the torturers, probably one of the contractors, that he exceeded the guidelines that were in the memos. We also have an example where Abu Zubaydah was ordered to be waterboarded an extra time after the interrogators on site with him said that he was complicit, he was compliant. And given the way the memo was written, that's also clearly against the guidelines of the memo. So even from what we know that the actions exceeded what was in the memo, both in time and in magnitude. So it's clear that there are prosecutable offenses there, even according to what Obama says.
I mean, I want to ask both of you what you think President Obama should do now, because he has said in the past that it's better to focus on the future and not on the past. Richard, what do you think are President Obama's options here?
Well, I can understand that President Obama is eager to avoid a partisan political fight when there's so many other challenges facing the presidency.
But is that a realistic goal, given that this is dividing Congress?
No, it isn't. Unfortunately, it's not a realistic goal, and therefore he has to choose either to bury the controversy about accountability and legality during the Bush years, or he has to demonstrate that he's willing to pay the political price for taking seriously these issues and putting the United States back on a constitutional course of government. It's a difficult choice, but I hope that in the end he'll make the right choice.
And if Cheney is found to have acted illegally, what should happen to him?
Well, I think one needs a commission of inquiry, a special prosecutor to make some recommendations based on more evidence and knowledge than is now available. But I would hope that it would be taken seriously, that we don't want to create a precedent where someone can act the way Dick Cheney has acted and get away with it.
And Marcy, final point to you. What do you think President Obama should do now?
Well, first, I think he may get to a point where he doesn't have a choice, because the courts seem to be ruling against his efforts to bury this. They're kind of chipping away at state secrets. The extraordinary rendition case in California may go forward. The suit against John Yoo may go forward. So he may not have a choice. But the other fundamental principle which is at stake here is that the Attorney General is supposed to be independent of the political goals and whims of the White House. And it's clear that Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod don't want to spend Obama's first term prosecuting Dick Cheney and George Bush. But Eric Holder needs to make that decision on his own, and I think he's getting closer to the point where he will, regardless of the pressure that he may or may not be getting from the White House. So it's not actually Obama's choice, it's Eric Holder's choice.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you to both of my guests, Professor Richard Falk and Marcy Wheeler. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments. Do email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But from me, Shuli Ghosh, for the moment, bye-bye.